Good evening, everyone. First, starting on closest to me on my right is Kathleen Frydl, or Frydl.
It's Frydl.
Frydl, a historian and author of The Drug Wars in America. Next, we have Hamilton Morris, an expert on psychedelic drugs and a trained chemist. And finally, we have César Gaviria, the former president of Colombia. He held that office from 1990 to 1994. That was the time during which, those were Pablo Escobar's final years. He was killed in 1993, and Gaviria's role during that very tumultuous time in Colombia's history has been immortalized in the telenovela Escobar, El Patrón de Mal. I thought we'd start with you, President Gaviria. Does this mean that the war on drugs is over?
No, the war on drugs is not over. I mean, hundreds of people, not to talk about thousands of people, are being killed in the war on drugs at this moment in Central America and Mexico and Colombia. It's still a big fight. What has changed significantly in the last 5 years, it's that from having an issue that was a taboo, we at the Commission promoted even a documentary called Breaking the Taboo, because it was like bad talking about drugs. It was bad seeing you were suspicious of talking about drugs, to an issue in which no one in this country really defends prohibitionism anymore. Not the people of the Drug Enforcement Administration or Homeland Security or SAR, Office of SAR. They don't put their face to defend prohibitionism really. They just talk about arguments, say, well, those statistics are not exactly right. That's what they have to say. But they don't have arguments anymore. To end up this introduction, when Vice President Biden was sent by President Obama before the last summit of Presidents of the Americas to talk to Central American presidents that were starting to talk about legalization of drugs and things like that. And so he wanted to defend the U.S. policy. A journalist asked him, Vice President Biden, what do you think about the legalization of all drugs? And so he says like this, he said, well, we can be worse than we are now. That was the very strong defense he did of prohibitionism. We could be worse. Yes, of course, we could be worse. I mean, if one day we just decide to totally change policy. Policy on drugs needs research, needs ideas, needs to look to other experiences. Drugs is a very complex issue, very, very complex. It's not easy to learn. The issues of law enforcement are totally different of the issues of prevention or treatment or anything like that. And you need to take that. There is no simple solutions to the problem of drugs. But there are, as the European says, and I think that has been very fortunate about the Europeans, they don't talk about good policies. They talk about reduction of harm. What is less bad for society, doing this or this? What is less bad for society? And you take the less bad for society. You don't take something that is good or that is simple or have answers for every question. You just take what is less bad for society. And less bad means less corruption, less violence, less money in jails, and something that has not been useful. I think that's been fortunate, because you will never get a policy that answers every question, that you can defend as very good, very effective, that will solve all problems. No one can offer you that. But you can improve what you have. You can do many things that are less bad or better for society, or what you do today.
Okay, there's a lot there that I want to ask you about. But first, I want to go to Hamilton and ask just the title question: Is the war on drugs over?
Yes, I would have to agree that it is not over at all. In light of the ridiculous heights of irrationality that existed in the past, it does seem like there's been some improvement, especially when you look at what the U.S. was like in the 70s and 80s with Ross Perot flying around in a helicopter looking for people smoking weed and paying vigilantes to arrest anyone using drugs. All this stuff was
Ross, he paid vigilantes to arrest. I didn't know.
pay
Yeah.
for the legal defense of anyone that informed on a drug user out of pocket.
Wow.
And this was considered like a very American patriotic thing to be doing. Anyway, so there's endless examples of just how ridiculous things were in the past, and in light of that, when you see things like cannabis being legalized in Colorado, it can be very encouraging, and it makes you feel a little bit optimistic. But even things like that are still ramifications of an underlying problem that I still don't feel is being addressed entirely. It's certainly an improvement, but it's also something that primarily impacts middle-class white Americans. It doesn't address a lot of the racial issues that underpin the drug war, and there's still a lot that needs to change, and I don't think that just decriminalizing cannabis is going to solve the problem. And the same is true internationally. If you look, I don't know if anyone here has been following what's happening in New Zealand at the moment, but there's some really interesting developments happening where what would generally be called designer drugs or gray market drugs are now legal to be sold for human consumption as recreational drugs. This is the first time in history something like this has happened. There's no medical pretense. They're not made for treating any sort of disorder. These are drugs being sold exclusively to make people feel good. And so on one hand, this seems like a very sophisticated, advanced way of dealing with the problem. But on the other hand, they still haven't legalized cannabis. They still haven't legalized the drugs that a lot of these gray market substances are replacing. And even though they're trying to elevate the gray market to a pharmaceutical standard, I don't truly believe that they are. And I think that it may be less harmful than selling these things as bath salts or potpourri, but it's certainly more harmful than allowing people access to the drugs that they wanted in the first place.
Thank you. So Kathleen, again, the title question, is the war on drugs over?
Well, it seems like we have a unanimous panel here. The war on drugs is not over. I want to thank Matt for organizing this panel, and he gave a summary of my book, but I want to expand on really the central intervention of it so I can answer that question properly. And that is, I argue in my book the reason why the United States went from a regulatory and taxing and tariff regime to regulate narcotics that are today illicit, the reason why it went from that regime to a criminal punishment regime of prohibition and the kind of prison industrial complex that we have today is because the drug war policy portfolio and ratcheting up punishment within that performed other valued tasks for the state. And that is to say that throughout the developing world, the drug war policy portfolio has been a central rationalization for intervention there, a way to funnel and channel resources, create alliances, break alliances. And within the United States, ratcheting up punishment served as a sign of central mechanism that changed policing in this country, which was in the hands of a largely white police force accustomed to discretionary tools that were being taken away from them as a result of the civil rights movement from outside of it, and as a result of the police professionalization movement from within it. The drug war and the kind of discretionary tools that it provided replaced the kind of historical tools that police had been accustomed to using within especially inner cities. So something I say to describe the book a lot is the central and defining addiction of the drug war is the government's addiction to a punishment regime. And unless we confront the government's addiction to the drug war, which means de facto confronting prohibition, we will not be rid of the drug war. And the only kind of segment within which, and it's been already alluded to, I've seen kind of any significant headway being made is the marijuana policy portfolio, where the rationale of prohibition is being challenged on every level. But I want to very quickly agree with Hamilton that the drug war, as it's been mobilized by the U.S. government, has featured so many racial and class biases within it that it would really be a shame if the drug reform movement kind of mimicked those race and class biases and failed to give attention to these other kinds of reforms that challenge prohibition in other areas outside of marijuana.
Is it a failure? And if you do think it is, how can we be so sure? How do we know that it wouldn't be worse if there weren't this massive enforcement and incarceration regime?
Well, it's absolutely a failure, yes, because it's just it's completely predicated on this false idea that it's a criminal problem as opposed to a medical problem. So it could never succeed. There's no way that the way it is currently constructed, it could ever address the problem that it's trying to address.
Hamilton, I want to ask you about a moment in your film about efavirenz use in Johannesburg. I guess it's a drug that's normally used to treat HIV, but then people mix it with rat poison and opiates and make this homebrewed concoction. Do I have that about right?
Yeah.
So you met a lot of these people, and you were back in sort of the rooms where they're doing this, and it's not a nice neighborhood, and some of the people you met seem really desperate. I mean, they're smoking literally rat poison in front of you. And one guy you talked to seemed really full of regret, and he was talking about what he used to look like in his old pictures and how his weight's changed and his body's changed. And so I wanted to ask you why. What are the root causes of addiction, of harmful drugs, and is there any role that the state should play in mitigating those causes?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
But
Or any one of you three. Yeah.
and there's a big difference between drug use and addiction, and I think that a lot of people would say that there's an innate human drive for intoxication that's not necessarily some sign of pathology, that it's completely healthy and normal.
I'm trying to sort of set the innocuous recreational use to the side and then focus on the people who even say for themselves
that's
it's
kind
a
of
problem.
Weird
Yeah.
example. The use of efavirenz recreationally in South Africa is maybe not the best because it's unclear exactly how prevalent it is and how much of a public health risk it is and what people's motivations for doing it are and how much of it is a journalistic construction. And so I almost feel like that specific example is too complicated to use to represent
Okay, well, heroin in Vermont then.
Heroin in Vermont.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Even that, I don't even.
No, I mean, there's like an epidemic happening, and people.
I've heard a little bit about this, but.
Is this all media construction, or is it actually happening?
Well, okay,
I mean, I haven't been to
this sort of
Vermont,
gets
so.
back to the question of silence or ambivalence politically and journalistically relating to the drug war. And I think that one thing you have to keep in mind with journalists is that journalism is not ideologically motivated. It's motivated by what I think of as just what's interesting, what's controversial, what will get clicks. And so when cannabis was legalized in Colorado, what I felt was that the people writing about it had no agenda to make it seem good or bad. It was just whatever would make the most interesting story. So if a teenager, and I don't know if this has happened, but it's like hypothetically, if a teenager gets high and gets into a car accident and kills a family or something, then that's a story. Then they're going to write, oh, maybe it wasn't such a good idea after all. A family just died. They were hit by a stoned teenager. Maybe we should rethink this policy because that's the good story. On the other hand, if some statistic comes out that says, oh, it turns out that lung cancer is reduced by 10% or something like that, then that's the story. Then that becomes what is written about. And right now, it's all so new that people don't even know what to think yet. I think that it's going to take a couple of years before people can even take any sort of stand and have a perspective on it that's really informed. It's been such a short period of time. But the question of why people use heroin in Vermont?
No. Does the state have a role ever in when people have a serious problem in trying to mitigate that?
I think they have a medical responsibility in helping people who want treatment to get that.
Please, yeah.
I just want to circle back to a couple of things that were said. I don't quibble with Hamilton's characterization of the journalist profession, but I think that there is a distinction to be made among professional journalists, particularly inside the Beltway journalists or others who rely on access for their stories. And I think one example of this, and I hate to step on New York toes here, but one example of this is the David Remnick interview that you've already cited with President Obama, because a lot of us read that interview, which was very long and detailed, and came to the remarks that he made about marijuana. And a follow-up question that any drug reformer would have had after the president announced that he just really didn't feel marijuana was any more or less dangerous than alcohol would be, then why the hell don't you take it off of Schedule I drug prohibition? And we're still wondering, why in the hell don't you take it off of Schedule I drug prohibition? It's completely within the executive's power to do that. And that question went unasked. So there's a lot of questions, I think, that go unasked when a journalist is relying upon access for stories, and I think a majority of them, frankly, do. When Matt asked about what is the state's responsibility towards the addict, I think it's a very good question, and I personally would like to see that responsibility affirmed and primarily enacted through the Affordable Care Act, which I think extends tremendous possibilities, I should say, to treat addiction. And I think we're very much in need of a kind of professional renaissance within the medical profession regarding addiction. Addiction accounts for 1 out of every $14 spent in the healthcare system. Addiction is an incredibly costly untreated addiction is an incredibly costly problem. And there's every reason to think and hope that treating addiction, screening for it much more regularly and much more routinely would save the entire healthcare system money and would be a venue that, if it didn't result in this kind of happy ending every time, it would at least achieve outcomes that the president has already cited are achieved in Portugal every day. Harm reduction outcomes that really do matter to public health system, reduced infection rates of HIV, for example, reduced addiction rates among teenagers. There are very important outcomes that a public health model delivers and has been shown to deliver, and I would prefer to see the state's responsibility to the addict, as you put it, enacted primarily through the healthcare venue rather than the criminal justice venue.
Can I ask a question?
Well, I think we're maybe 15, 20 minutes, but you're first, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that the solution to a lot of these problems isn't all that complicated a lot of the time. Addiction is a very complicated thing, but for example, there's a drug called naloxone that very effectively treats opioid overdoses. This is not a new drug. It was first synthesized in 1960. It's been used clinically for decades, but it wasn't until yesterday that the FDA approved it as a treatment for opioid overdose that could be dispensed as an auto-injector to people at risk for that sort of thing. And more people die of drug overdoses in the US than car accidents. So this is like a really easy way to treat a very significant problem with a known intervention that just had been withheld until yesterday.
But it's no longer being withheld.
Yeah. So again,
So I'm hearing that you guys are not altogether happy with the status quo. Am I being too okay? But
you have to come with a statement that I think is true. Addictions and drugs are bad, and all drugs are bad. All drugs of stimulants or whatever they are bad. They are not good. But the solution is not prohibition. The solution is regulation, research, trial and error, taking risks, looking at other experiences.
How far would you like to see it go, based on all the research that your group's done? What would be a efficient endpoint for as we look at these things and loosen prohibition? How far would you like to see it loosened?
I tend to agree with him in one thing. The solution to the problem of heroin is very simple. You authorize doctors to prescribe heroin to people if they are addicted under certain conditions. And at that moment, the illegal market will disappear, and the problem of violence and corruption will disappear.
Well,
of course, you need a special legislation, particularly in this country. But if you want to deal with that in a much more intelligent way, instead of getting heroin in any street of New York or any place in an illegal way, it will be much better if doctors can do it.
Well, I would disagree about all drugs being bad. I think it's not necessarily good to make those sorts of value judgments, because they're just chemicals that exist within a cultural matrix, and they don't really have any, every drug has an ambivalent potential. It can be anything. Cocaine is a perfect example. When pure cocaine hydrochloride is snorted, it's generally problematic for habitual users. When coca leaves are chewed, traditionally, it's not problematic at all. It's not associated with cardiotoxicity, it's not associated with any sort of significant addiction. It may even have health benefits. And so the line between a drug and a medicine is not a clear line. And I think if you just...
But that is a very technical thing. If you want to talk about public policy, you need statements that are credible for everyone and you can sell. If you start to say drugs are bad, people will be much more open in their minds. That if you say, no, some drugs are not that bad, you can let people go. No. I do agree with you. I do agree. And I have some sympathy for some libertarian arguments.
Which of the three would you endorse or not?
Well, I think decriminalization is certainly necessary because of all, marijuana is an exception in that there's so many people willing to stand up for it. There are so many other drugs, as was alluded to previously, like LSD, that are immensely important scientifically, especially, that no one is going to campaign to have legalized. And people say, oh, prohibition doesn't work, it doesn't do anything, people still use the drugs. Well, it definitely works on scientists. That's one type of person that is without question impacted by prohibition. And if a drug is scheduled,
real quick, why is LSD important scientifically? That's just not. I know you're.
It's important in psychopharmacology. It's important for studying the 5-HT2A receptor, for studying cluster headaches, studying depression, studying consciousness. It has a lot of. Right.
Yeah. No.
Okay.
I just know you know this stuff very well. So please go.
There's all these scheduled substances that no one is ever going to stand up for, and that are very important scientifically and are essentially inaccessible without going through all sorts of bureaucratic hurdles. And unless there's a blanket decriminalization of all these things that they can be used scientifically, a lot of the most negative ramifications of the drug war are going to stick around for a long time.
And do either of you have anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I think there's an overemphasis. Of course, politicians have a huge influence on all of this, but I think that people need to have a personal responsibility in the way they conduct themselves, and journalists also have an enormous responsibility. When you look at the history of a lot of the drugs that have been scheduled, it has to do with the action of individuals who are not politicians. Salvinorin A was scheduled largely by a mother named Kathy Chidester, who thought that her son's suicide was responsible. She thought Salvinorin A was responsible for her son's suicide. It's true of many other drugs. 2CT7 was scheduled essentially because of one Rolling Stone article written by a journalist who just, wrote this as a frivolous thing, and the result is that a very important drug that could be used in scientific research is now no longer available. So people have a responsibility to behave maturely with drugs and to understand that every time that a politician feels that they can gain some political traction by demonizing drugs, they will do that. The moment that politicians don't feel that they can get votes by being hard on drugs, they will change. I think a lot of the journalists that say negative things about drugs and the politicians that say negative things about drugs are entirely ambivalent. Nancy Reagan just chose all this Just Say No stuff because she didn't have anything to do in the White House and was being criticized because she spent $200,000 on new plates. And that's true.
That was the only reason. Okay, yeah.